Dr. Al, it is great to have you back. Hey, before we get rolling here, I just want to let you know that in preparation for this episode, I was looking through a bunch of books about magic and kinds of magic, and I came across this one book that was really cool. It was a grimoire about how to do magic rituals in a stairwell. It was a step-by-step guide. Step by step, because it's in a stairwell. Terrible, but I absolutely love it. Hey, everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This Podcast, a podcast about magic. I'm still laughing at my own joke.
Your commitment to the bit was exceptional.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Hello, everyone. Welcome to What Magic Is This Podcast, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and we are going to be putting a close. We're going to be closing this series of the Books of Magic specials with an absolute doozy, because I am talking to one of my favorite people in the world about something very, very specific. So before we talk about the topic, I would like to introduce this guest. They are a practicing as well as consulting magician, scholar, and author. His works include the excellent book of The Art of Magic, Starry Rubric, and A Book of the Magi. He is co-host of the great and amazing magical podcast Radio Free Golgotha with Jesse Hathaway Diaz, and also a founder of one of the only Facebook groups worth joining, Folk Necromancy. Without a doubt, perhaps my favorite magician alive at this moment. I am honored to welcome back for the third time the modern Cunning Man, Dr. Alexander Cummins. Dr. Cummins, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Gosh, it's great to be back, Douglas. It's good to go for the hat trick. And it's always
You're the first guest that's been back 3 times. You've.
Well, that's a feather in my cap already, right? It's always a treat to chat to you about stuff. Yeah,
fantastic. So what happened is that I made this series. I announced this series, and I kind of knew, Cyprian. Okay, cool. Blue Grimoires, Bibliotech Blue, also very cool. But I was like, you know what? I just have to reach out to Dr. Al, because I'm going to be talking about books of magic. There's one person when I think books of magic and people that study them and look at them and take them apart, it's got to be Dr. Al. So I gave Dr. Al, Dr. C, a poke and be like, hey, what do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about Faustian grimoires? What do you want to do? And we had this back and forth. And he said, you know what? I really like this idea of looking at magicians' workbooks. With that in mind, let's jump right in here. Let's get on into it. What are we going to be talking about specifically with this episode that I've entitled Magicians' Workbooks with Dr. Alexander Cummins?
Well, what we got excited about chatting about, or I got excited about at least, is this notion of workbooks, things that get called working books sometimes, collections of magical operations, collections of charms, spells, spirit catalogs, even sometimes short spirit catalogs, spirit lists at the very least, formulary of incenses, of charm ingredients, of things like that. The working books of working magicians, specifically those that get called service magicians sometimes, who are not just doing magic for themselves, but doing work for others, either on a very professional client basis or occasionally for wider members of their community.
Got it, for sure. What is the difference between a magician's workbook and grimoires?
This is a big one, right? So I've scaffolded this a little bit because I've been scratching my head on this for a while. So I want to take us on a journey, if we like. I want to think about a couple different models that we can get ever more towards chipping away at what they aren't. I don't want to go full post-structuralist on this, but okay. So if we start off, we can think about a grimoire most broadly as a book of magic, right? A book containing a bunch of magic instructions, as your wonderful commitment to that joke that kicked us off, like a step-by-step, right? Of some kind or another. Maybe it's ordered in a strange way. And again, I always think of the way that a lot of manuscript books are written before there's any whiteout, before there's any Tipex, before there's certainly copy paste, right? So these long run-on sentences are like, I started and then I had a thought and then there was a tangent, but we're going to keep going, right? So we can think about grimoires most broadly as a book of magic. If that's the case, then workbooks are a kind of grimoire. That's our broadest and probably least helpful definition, right? I think we could even advance, and I'm going to explore this idea before I kind of throw it away as well, that we might see grimoires as a kind of workbook as well. I'll try and develop this point as we go. Now, if we think about a grimoire as a discrete system of magic, do you have a system, right? With more of these step-by-step instructions, then working books start to look more like compendia, miscellanies of magical operations, as well as the personal notebooks of the working practitioners who compiled them. These become then less a received system and more options for work, right? That said, they often demonstrate the cohered personal practice of the compiler, or at the very least, represent the kind of magics that this copyist could get their hands on, right? And again, this idea is that they're less how Solomon or Faust or whoever did their magic, and more how I do it, right? Albeit sometimes and often reordered and tweaked bits of older stuff. So when we talk about personal books of magic, we are also even more specifically talking about those used by cunning European service magicians as their working books, as their reference material, as their books of calls, their ritual scripts, their incense formularies and stuff. They can definitely be distinguished as not just books that are magic. I mean, there's nothing just about that, but the Liber Spiritum, right? We're not talking necessarily about a book that has a demon or demons bound into it, right? It's reference material of some degree or another.
Okay.
Now, workbooks also often include either whole Grimoiric systems or useful sections from Grimoiric texts. This makes sense, right? They're reference materials. They're giving you a set of things that you could do, options for work, right? Sections of the Heptameron, and particularly the kind of Spirit Spotter's Guide from the fourth book of Occult Philosophy, are very popular in early modern English working books. To an extent, these working books, therefore, are like assemblages of older Grimoiric material. And here's where it starts to get into it, because they're also assemblages of other people's workbooks, right? Especially in British cunning craft, there's also a lot of formal medieval operations that get streamlined to something sometimes simpler, sometimes more specific. But this raises the issue of how grimoires might be conceived of as someone's workbook at some point, right? And I don't just mean the mythic point about like the Key of Solomon is thought mythically as Solomon's workbook, or even perhaps historically, if we're distinguishing King Solomon from maybe the 9th, 10th century wizard who was also called Solomon, that some kind of Grimoiric archaeologists are now saying might be the basis of it. But what I'm saying is that even formal grimoires like the Key of Solomon, a lot of their actual spell work is taken from folk magic, right? We look at, even Mather's edition with there's cosinomancy in there, like Sieve and Shears divination. There's thief detection in there. I think there's even like a hunting spell or two. There is, yep. It's worth pointing out, basically, that this supposed high culture feeds on supposedly low culture a lot more than low culture apes or corrupts noble hieratic mysteries, right?
Right.
It's also worth pointing out that these workbooks also might include sections of occult philosophical treatises on how to do magic. They're not all just recipes with no reflection on the hows or even the whys. We see this even with one of the workbooks of mid-17th century London Cunning Man, Arthur Gauntlet. It's one of the first entries in there are what he calls the instructions of Cyprian, which are not so much your circle must be this big. They're, have you paid attention to the star weather? Have you, got your shit together, right? Are you confident in what you're doing? Do you have everything you need, right? Really practical stuff. But there's also extracts of again, the magical ceremonies of the fourth book of Occult Philosophy in there. They're not all just lists of spells. There's also some sense of reflection and some sense of theorizing towards practical ends in there.
Right.
These workbooks might also include personal notes of the operator, and at least their selection and editing processes and some of the decisions they make in copying them out show interest in worldviews by, how and what they copied out and how and why. There's some fascinating examples of this that Frank Clarson and Sharon Hubbs Wright have pointed out in some relatively recent publications about how there are shifts in a text that's gone through several different working magicians' hands these shifts of these editing and re-editing between a language of very strict compelling in the conjurations and some more kind of like respectful language. So like people writing in, calling saying that, well, some senior demons are technically angels, right? And being like noble kings when they turn up, and other people crossing that out and being like, no, foul spirit. And then it goes back and forth. So there's these decisions and these worldviews and these discernments, I guess we could say, or these like edits that are also important, and we can track through these things. Is this making sense so far?
Making very much. Yeah, definitely. I do love, one of the things that I think kind of classifies something as being a magician's workbooks, and this is my default, and it's definitely not as well thought out as yours. It's just like, is there marginalia from at least one magician? Like, is there stuff in there where you can see that somebody had this book and was trying to work with it, or even has an opinion of it, or because a lot of times people will just write in them and they'll bring in their philosophy or how they view, most likely it's Christianity. But then other instances where like, oh, there's definitely somebody behind that isn't just a copyist. They are actively, you can tell they're actively going to this book and probably doing things from this book.
Yeah, and I think that's the crucial point, because the difficulty of saying, well, potentially all compendia are working books is, A, that might well still be too broad, but also, like you said, not everyone who wrote down spells actually did them, right? They've always been, shall we say, occult theorists who are more interested in like the collection of these things and the discussion of them than the actual practical application of them.
Owen Davies talks about how in Grimoires that there was somebody who was shitting on people that were more obviously upper class and just being like, make sure you have your copy of Agrippa's 4th book of Occult Philosophy out, because people will be like, oh my goodness, what's this? So sometimes they could be novelty, like just an old grimoire that looks spooky and it's got circles from the Heptameron. Like that's a lot of people just did that.
Yeah. Having big, impressive books on your shelf is also nothing new, right? Yeah, exactly. This becomes
and points to his bookshelf behind him. Hey.
Oh no shade. I mean, just no at all. There's also an issue with when Owen Davies talks about that, of like, this is also an issue with outright fraud as well, right. Which is which all professions and all healing professions suffer from. Perhaps more magic, and perhaps more in modern times. This may be a huge tangent, but the idea of like, what does it mean to be able to also not? So on the one hand, you've got just showing off stuff that you don't actually understand and pretending you know what you're talking about at one end of the spectrum. On the other end, you've also got this idea that like a lot of working magicians, and especially these like service magicians and cunning folk, did incredibly idiosyncratic things in their practice and needed a way to be able to explain what they were doing in a language and a grammar that was understandable by their clients. That's why you get a lot of people talking astrologically or pseudo-astrologically. When they get down to it, they're like, oh, I just talked to a spirit about it. But like, to the clients, I have to frame it in a certain way. And at what point is this lying? At what point is this marketing? And at what point is this building a communication bridge halfway? Again, that stuff really fascinates me and becomes one of the features that is important when we look at these kinds of service magics and their documents and sources and texts, because it's also I will get into this. It's also a huge and long-standing tradition for more formal magicians to tell less formal magicians that they're not doing it properly, right?
For sure.
It brings us back to this point about like, is a compendium there for reference? Are they being regularly used? How regularly do they need to use them for it to count as that? In conversation recently with Daniel Harms for one of the cunning conversations I did for my secret library of a Patreon, he was pretty critical about trying to overly reify separation between like a compendium of magic, a Gallimaufry or a miscellany, a working book, and a grimoire. And I think what's a helpful or best description, working description, if not definition of a workbook, is a magic book that is used by a service magician. That might include elements of personal spellbook and notes, as well as collections of workings, charms, sigils, spirit lists, conjurations, etc., even whole or partial grimoire systems themselves. But I think this emphasis on does the text itself show that it has stuff in there that was applicable to others, right, is really, really important. And is one of the best ways we can navigate this very uncertain water at times.
Definitely. Very well put, for sure. That was a wonderful conversation. And I'm going to big you up right now. That Dr. Al's Patreon is a wonderful thing, everybody. And he does talk to some of the most enlightening and wonderful people. And he did have this conversation with Dan Harms, who somebody I wish I had on my show someday. I know I will, but just the conversation was like, oh, I'm just taking notes the entire time. Just what is these guys? They just know so much. It's unreal. But it was such a wonderful, thing. And I hope and I wish more people knew about what you do on your Patreon, because it's really quite fantastic.
Oh, thanks, mate. It's nice to be able to talk in person, even through a screen, with Dan, because he does things like correct the fact that I was calling the Book of Oberon's shelf mark Folger, and apparently it is Folger, like Folger. Coffee.
That's right.
Yeah. So correcting the things that you've only seen written down, kind of stuff.
We're going to get into some iffy pronunciation of things a little bit later on here. Before we got the mics rolling, there's a word we're both like, I don't know if that's the way we're supposed to, because I've only ever seen it in print. I've never heard other people talk about this. Let's talk about history a little bit. This is something that I know before every episode, I tend to have a discussion and question form that I send to my guest, and I try to ask them to look at it. In this instance, I was like, can you please look at this, Dr. Al, because I need to know that if I'm on the right foot. And you thankfully did. A lot of guests, they just don't even look at it. But you said that this is a question that's this is a hard one to go for. So I'm going to ask it regardless. But besides something like the PGM, what would you consider to be the oldest and best preserved magician's notebooks? Or is it just the PGM?
I think this is a tricky question for a couple reasons.
Okay.
So the PGM is an interesting example because it's we're pretty sure it's in part some collections of spellbooks that were made for others, right? So they're being collected up for a king or a noble or a patron or something like that. So they are a collection. They are meant to be worked. They show evidence of like, hey, if this thing doesn't happen, then you can do this instead, like all that kind of thing. The ifs then flowcharts of it. So I think we could, but I also think that if we're talking about service magicians as distinct from a priestly class, and they weren't always, the conjuring parson is as much a powerful myth in a lot of like English kind of lore as much as it was occasionally like real. Certainly there were astrologer physicians who were also clergymen. But if we're talking about like as distinct from that, as having a different role from most people, then we end up with this emphasis on these kinds of working books of cunning folk from between the 15th and 19th centuries, partly because they are working in contrast to witches, to those who do malevolent harm. Unbewitching is an incredibly important part of their work. And until we have a model of what a witch is, we don't necessarily have something to contrast them to necessarily. So there are going to be all sorts of examples before the 15th century of things that we could show were books that people worked. But I'm far more familiar as an early modernist with when it gets into this specific kind of service magician that I think it's helpful for us to bear in mind as a descriptor of what we mean, especially when it comes to client work and being able to distinguish that kind of thing.
For sure, definitely. Okay, I have to ask, because this is something that you do specialize in, but why do most of the documents that we're going to be calling magicians' workbooks, but basically from the 15th to the 19th century, as you say, why do most of the ones that we seem to have come from England? What was going on in England that allowed for these things to be saved, that we still have them in collections now?
Well, there's a couple things here, right? Like the documents of working service magicians like cunning folk were often distinguished both by historical historians and historical practitioners, and also modern historians and some modern practitioners, very much distinguished from more formal again, heavy scare quote, Solomonic grimoires. That was present at the time. That was known that they weren't necessarily the same thing. The history that Elias Ashmole, who again this antiquarian who does a lot of the work collecting things, that's why they named the museum after him. That he commissions that William Lilly is meant to put together this autobiography, which you get the sense that Lilly wants to tell the rags to riches story of how like a ditcher's son from this small town becomes one of the most famous astrologers of his day, and it seems like you've got Elias Ashmole at his shoulder being like, but what magicians did you meet?
Right.
And it becomes often an account of magicians I have met and disapproved of. Because
I love that document. That book is incredible.
Because they're cunning folk. They're people that are like not necessarily doing all of the formal purifications. They're swearing too much. They're not going to church enough. But damn it, somehow they've managed to make their stuff work, except when they don't. And again, Lily loves to talk about when they get it wrong and things like that. But there's definitely this distinguishment between, by the 17th century anyway, of like, there's a proper way to do magic, and then there's these people that seem to be making it work somehow that we're kind of suspicious of. There's this wonderful quote from E.M. Butler when she's talking about some of the things that are in Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, which becomes one of the texts that inadvertently popularizes a bunch of and makes available a bunch of ritual magic. It's been called like the first English language print grimoire, right? She says, any adept of the school of Solomon on the continent would harbor uneasy feeling on perusing this text that English magicians, like English statesmen, must have provoked disaster by being ill-prepared. The informal and happy-go-lucky nature of the preparations includes no daunting instructions about the forging of instruments, the tanning of skins, or the mixing of inks. So again, it's like, I love saying like the idea of like, they don't even make their own black-handled knives.
That's
like
right.
is nothing new either.
Right.
And so on the one hand, the English are very like, there's a class consciousness going on. Oh, we're talking English history. We have to talk about class. Who would have believed?
Right.
So there's definitely that thing going on. Now, on the other hand, there are obviously working folk magicians in Europe too. So what we might also be looking at is a bias of the extent scholarship rather than a dearth of actual historical practice. What I can say is that the English Revolution definitely has a part to play in the wider circulation of magical texts. So yes, we get Scott's coming out in 1584 and then goes through multiple editions. By 1665, they've definitely realized that like most of the people buying this are trying to do this stuff. We should put more of that stuff in it. So more discourses about the natures of spirits are added, right? Again, the booksellers know their market. But what we also see is between 1640 and 1660, with a bunch of civil wars, that the restrictions on printing presses are almost entirely lifted. Previous to that, you needed, and afterwards, you need someone from some either ecclesiastical court or even someone connected to the crown itself or its courts or instruments, apparatus of control to sign off on your book in some way. And in the period between that, you get this explosion in the printing presses of like, yes, so much astrology. It's said that the English learned to read from their almanacs. And again, a bunch of continental people are very upset that they're not reading the Bible more. But you also get a lot of occult texts. You get a lot of a lot more access for these folk practitioners, for these service magicians, to be able to have texts to adapt and streamline. And I would also say, in the case of like England particularly, we have more writing on folk magicians, on cunning folk from England, because anti-witchcraft writers like George Gifford, like Edward Peyton, William Perkins and various others, often Puritans, were more concerned with, quote, white witches, with cunning folk, than they were with sabbatic diabolists. They were more concerned with the wise woman down the road selling you charms than they were with the idea that there were black witches in league with the devil who were like, poisoning your cattle. They were more concerned with the little magics, with the little charms and things like that. They said they were worse in some cases because they were apparently innocuous and because ignorant commoners would defend them because, spoiler alert, they worked, right? This itself is in part because of the Reformation, right? The old ways, i.e. the Catholic ways, were suspect in England, whereas we can make a case that in many parts of wider Europe and beyond, Catholic authorities were a little less interested in persecuting folk healing. There are plenty of exceptions to that, but in general, they were less interested in like, oh, they're saying the prayers that we all acknowledge have a spiritual efficacy. Yeah, and they wrote less about them as a result.
Yeah. They might have been more interested in, correct me if I'm wrong, but in continental Europe, they were more interested in heresy more so than like people, just like doing this kind of stuff. And,
yeah.
But what can you do? Do most of these documents, do you suspect that a lot of these things that we call magicians' workbooks were just destroyed because either people didn't understand them or just the ravages of time or just people just chucked them out? Like,
this is pretty common in a bunch of like trials that weren't necessarily full witch trials, but might include some element of criminality or something like that just in case the books were gotten rid of in some way or went missing in some form. Like the Inquisition, I think, has a role in this. Of course, not to get too Dan Brown, but like it does seem that the Vatican has stockpiles of things that they are slowly and begrudgingly releasing. But again, I think there's a role here in the English Reformation and the separating of England from the Catholic world that's going on, right? Again, the slightly different conceptions of witchcraft that we see across the continent, like European attitudes towards the inhumanity of witches, for instance, rather than just being in league with the devil, that you've got all these notions of witches and the things that they write being inhuman in some way. But again, we also might just need more focused study of the material filed away in library basements. Jose Leitao is doing fantastic work on Iberian folk grimoires and like treasure hunting manuals and Cyprianic magic, and has like excellent examples of the fruitfulness of this sort of work as well. So they weren't all lost. Some of them are just in basements, have been filed or misfiled. Other examples of like European kind of working books and stuff. We've got a lot of Northern European cunning, a lot of things that get called trolldom, preserved in Swedish folklore archives, partly because the Victorian ethnographers and folklorists in that part of the world were just really good at cataloging the material, like spent a lot more time noting down, and if not taking seriously, then at least taking seriously their studies of the thing, like writing down the people and the times and the places that this stuff was recorded, was passed on to them. And again, they also have a slightly different version of witch hunts and witch trials, which probably gives some context for this as well. So it is out there.
Right. Yeah. But definitely what also occurred was just definitely a lot of them were destroyed. I forget where I read it, but there was, I believe it was 17th century Venice, particularly. I mean, we're going a little bit off.
Oh, hell yeah.
They were just talking about how they were burning books, but they weren't burning them because they were like looking at them and seeing that they were heretical, but just there were so many of them. They were just like, we don't have space to, like in a place like Venice where space is at a premium. They were just like, we're burning these things because there's so many of them. And Venice at that point was one of the best places to get things published, if not the place to get stuff published,
right.
16th, 17th century. But they were just like, the Inquisition was burning them more so for practical reasons than the fact that they just like were like
shelf space.
Yeah, literally. I forget the name of the book where I got this from. But anyways, it was these things have been around, and there probably was a lot more than what we think. But I have to ask you, for the most part, what strata of society were making these workbooks? Because you'd have to be literate, would you not, to make them? Were they rich aristocrats, or were those the ones getting the copyists to copy whatever clavicula they came across to put on their bookshelf and to look cool? And maybe they were dabbling every once in a while. But as far as magician cunning folk, what would you say? Like, where did they fit in society?
So if we're talking about service magicians, we would generally mostly, if we're talking about like a demographic of who most of them were, we're seeing a range of like working class and lower middle class operators mostly. There's a lot of teachers. Like you said, knowing to read, especially knowing Latin, was very helpful for actually using and crucially like adapting some of the older ritual magics. I think in some modern cases that's been ever so slightly overemphasized. There were plenty of people who were just like kind of garbling their way through to a greater or lesser degree. You also see the translation of these things occurring at various different times and people getting access to far older works that were translated early and then working with those. And we see shifts and patterns of things that crop up later in Latin as well as earlier, if that makes any sense at all. So like it's also worth bearing in mind that literacy isn't an on-off switch, right? It's not a binary. We can be partially literate in a bunch of things. In terms of like Venice and stuff, also worth pointing out that like I was reading a study that was showing that semi and even illiterate women were heavily involved in some of the copying out of grimoires, because you don't actually need to be able to understand a book to copy it out necessarily, especially if you're doing it by hand, especially if like a manuscript and certain inks are considered like more powerful. And so I was reading someone, Maria Ortega maybe, who was talking about it was particularly something that sex workers did as a side hustle. They would also copy out little grimoires and little workbooks for their Johns and for others. We also see a lot of craftspeople, and especially I've noted. So we do get some magical profession stuff. I don't see too many people. There are like the outright magical professions, like your blacksmiths. They seem to be already doing enough magic to not need to be doing it in books as well.
Right.
But you do see, you've got like some clergy folk that seem to be doing some stuff that looks pretty service magic-y. You also see a predominance, I've noticed, of tailors, and I'm still kind of, I've got a bunch of theories about why that is. They have not exactly patrons that they're like beholden to, but they are doing big jobs like in singular ways for rich people. They've got a bit more mobility. They've got access to materials. It's not unusual for tailors to get parcels from far away. They measure people, which like girdle measuring and things like that are still parts of various folk magics.
Right.
They work with scissors. I don't know. This is becoming speculation, but I've noticed a predominance of tailors who are also cunning folk. I mean, it's worth pointing out that not all service magicians are. If we're just going by the definition of like a magician who gets paid to do magic for others, you do get courtly service magicians, which again we might distinguish from your John Dees and your like court astrologers who were doing magic, like working magic for rich people. That stuff tends to look more like gambling magic, which at various points was illegal for poor people to do, and more to the point, they didn't have a lot to gamble with. You also see a lot more magical assassination. Rich people are more happy to try and off each other with sorcerers. So you do get the occasional ones, but by and large, most of them are, your village wizard and wise woman.
For sure. Yeah, it's very fascinating. You were mentioning about the tailor. Sorry to just go back to that. That is that is very fascinating. But all of the points you mentioned, particularly the getting materials from elsewhere, that kind of like that makes a ton of sense to me. That's
right.
Man, and as well as the sex workers doing copying of, was this in France? Do you know that this was going on with the Bibliothèque Blue grimoires or things like that, or is it just kind of
the accounts I read were about like Venice and things like that? But I wouldn't put it past it. Again, this shows that like when we talk about a clerical underground, that's important, but that's also overlapping with a larger demimonde and underground, right? Of gray and black markets of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, by this point, though, particularly something like the clerical underground, as it was put forth by Richard Kuyper, would that have been dissipated by this point more so, and it was just kind of clerical dabblers, just a little side hustle kind of stuff, or are we not able to tell at this point what was going on?
Potentially. I mean, one of the big factors that, say, Dr. Francis Young points out is that with the dissolution of the monasteries, a lot of the monasteries were keepers of old and, in some cases, imported magic books, and suddenly they're not. There's no monastery to keep them in anymore, right? Kind of shelf space issue again, and that it does seem that many former monks were like, "Well, I got to try and make a living doing something now," and so it could well be that some of these ex-monks start to get involved in some service magic as well.
There's a movie there. Let's write the script, Dr. Al, you and me. We'll do we'll get a Netflix. They're giving Netflix series out to everybody. I mean, that's such a fascinating thing. I think that's incredible, man. I would just love to research more about that period of
my dad wants me to do a series of detective novels about like a cunning person. I mean, like a lot of their stuff is literally detection magic. Just doing it by yes, following people around and stuff, but also, calling up spirits in thumbnails and things and glasses of water and stuff to surveil magically rather than, classic PI stuff.
Listen to your dad. I'm going to say, do it. Listen to your father. I'd love that. That'd be dope. Oh man, I'm sick and tired of people. I mean, it's a good series, but I get emails like, "Have you heard of this book, Dr. Norrell?" And it's like, yes, I have. I know about this. It's like the Harry Potter that nobody knows. It's like, trust me, it's fun. It's fun. It's great. It really is.
Oh my goodness!
Everybody stop emailing me about. Please.
Some of the flashbacks I had to when I was working away at big school at my doctorate about a board of people being like, but of course practical magic is far beneath us, was a little too real for me, I'll be honest.
Yeah, no doubt. Goodness. So let's talk about the contents of these things. What do we see in these workbooks that make them a little bit, we touched on it, but let's get a bit more specific. What makes them, what kind of content make them different than just the regular like copied grimoire of, say, like something that Sibley would have or some variety of that? What's in these things that makes them workbooks?
Sure. To an extent, we're seeing a lot of varying degrees of streamlining, especially of more complicated prep, especially if we're going to compare it to like formal medieval works.
Right.
We don't see a lot of like 40-day preparations of fasting and things like that. This comes down to some of the ingredients and tools that are used as well. It's a lot more common to see make or even purchase a new or an unused knife and make sure it's clean rather than forging your own blade. Although we do see some examples of that. There's just less expensive equipment in general. There's fewer like gold rings and things like that. Again, because a lot of this stuff is being done by and poor people with less economic resources. We see less reliance on complicit priests, like say the Nigromancia, which again is part of that like treasure house of the spirits, the Thesaurus Spiritum kind of genre of grimoires that are also very popular. But some versions of those have the idea that like you don't necessarily consecrate your gear, you get a priest who doesn't mind doing it, to do a lot of it for you, to invest you with your magic sword and things. And just generally, we don't see as much about fellows and certainly servants doing things for you in general. There's less talk of like your servants holding your extra magical gear while you're flaunting your magic sword in the circle, right? We also see a lot more, I would say, divination and magic for practical everyday concerns. Now, that's not to say grimoires or like other formal systems didn't also exist that were very practical, but we see a lot more thief detection, return of stolen goods, staunching blood, those kind of like short charms as well. We see a lot more medical charms and formulary and cures for animals. For instance, as well, we see a lot more hunting and fishing charms, a lot more stuff for getting out of prison, and in general, the kinds of magic for people who are not necessarily terribly privileged in their economic circumstances. We also, we get like a lot more remnants in general and adaptations of older charms too, interestingly. So it's not all just like new versions of things, especially in the English corpus. So like, important to bear in mind that especially by like the 17th century, formal Solomonic magic and even early lodge masonry were very trendy, and using the old charms, trendy in like, more upper class circles, and using the old charms was seen as a bit like basic or even like rustic. So again, like class is like a really important thing to bear in mind about this.
Right.
The other thing we see, I think, a lot more of is counter magic. A lot more unbewitching, a lot more unwitching, a lot of work for people who've been forspoken or looked over or overlooked with the evil eye, a lot of practical curse breaking, anti-maleficia, house protections, apotropaic amulets, folk exorcisms, and various ways that tech is being adapted to be able to do those things. One of the examples that I'm especially interested in at the moment is the idea of and the practice of conjuring the spirit of the witch or the thief or the enemy who is doing your client wrong. And when I say spirit, I don't just mean conjuring the imps or devils that they're sending forth and like paying them off, although that was a thing as well. But the idea of conjuring the spirit of the currently alive malefic practitioner or thief, if we could say spirit, like soul might be a better term, that like in the same way it was understood in folk belief that like your soul could wander from your body while you were sleeping or even dreaming, and there's some overlap there and that kind of stuff, but that you could call up the soul of the person who has stolen your goods and use the same tech to compel a demon to do things or not do things, crucially, to like an alive person who has, stolen your linens or something like that. So again, this idea of not just getting rid of the complicated stuff of conjuration, but of finding ways to embed it more in the practical concerns of clients and communities. That's like absolutely fascinating to me.
Phantasms of the living. So they were doing that stuff way before the spiritualists back in the 19th century. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And you see traces of that in like certain like fairy doctoring traditions and stuff that looks like sitting out as well in more northern traditions, where you would find a spot near or around the churchyard, and you could see a procession of the souls of the living, or rather the souls of the soon to not be living, marching along. And so, there's all sorts of lore about like seeing your own face there, especially in Ireland, and that's related to a bunch of doppelganger things. But the idea of like, you could conjure a living person into, or some aspect of a living person into a crystal ball or an oiled thumbnail or a glass of water, and affect them and readjust the current enmity or relationship that was happening.
Awesome. That's incredible. Do these documents, these magicians' workbooks, do they tell us anything about the people that, if not composed them, but who owned them?
Yeah, in particular. Yeah, so they definitely demonstrate a particular set of interests they had. One of the things that's interesting, again, talking to Dan Harms about this, is examples where there are multiple similar charms that are collected. Now, this, again, might be a collector's impulse, right? But especially when they're almost the same but just have some slight variations, that also looks to me like professional meticulousness, right? Looking at all the different options so that you could work out what else you could do with it. I think for working service magicians, this can also sometimes reflect the demands of their clients as well. Arthur Gauntlet is called a particularly bawdy fellow by Lilly in passing in his right. autobiography, right. And he does have at least 18 different apple spells for lust in his grimoire, in his workbook. So he also has a bunch of stuff.
I wonder why.
Yeah, right. He also has a ton of stuff to do with vervain. So there's also a little sense here of like a lot of the time, and it's something that cunning folk were accused of by people that didn't like them and their magics, that they relied on 2 or 3 ingredients to do everything. And again, I think that can be a feature and not a bug, frankly. It's not uncommon in like modern occult parlance to talk about how building a personal relationship with a plant spirit means that plant spirit might be happy to do things with you that aren't in some book, right? It becomes about relationship and that kind of thing. And so I think we can, to some extent, see, yes, demands of clients, but also the particular plant allies that a particular cunning man might rely on, like Gauntlet and his vervain, for instance. We see some like variations of how and crucially where they lived as well. So cunning folk are often very much linked to the English imagination of the rural, if not the rural itself. And they did have important roles to play. Again, Owen Davies talks about this a lot, and really, really helpfully, about how they played a role of like sheriff or local policeman before there was a police force, of thief catchers, of things like that, even standing in place of like magistrates and like, civil officials in places where they were particularly respected. But we also have a range of urban practitioners by the early modern period. These guys, often because they're living closer together, often like kind of pod off into particular magical specialities. Dr. Tabitha Stanmore's recent work on cunning folk has a really great example at the beginning of a poor lady who loses her spoons and goes to a variety of different cunning folk trying to find someone that does that specific sort of lost property detection and return of missing goods, and gets like referred. Like she kind of pinballs between a bunch of different practitioners in London who are either unwilling to take her case or are like, no, you want to talk to the cunning man down the road that does that. I do more blood staunching or that kind of stuff. The other thing about looking at urban practitioners that gets a bit more sticky is that they often have a lot more overlap with astrologer physicians as well. And in some cases, it seems certain cunning folk were doing a little bit of both. But there's different demands that an urban environment and its communities and clients have. But it's also interesting noting which ones do what. We see, say, like Mary Parish, a London cunning woman with a grimoire that she at various points has to pawn.
Right.
Because of like her husband's like drinking debts and things like that. But she has stuff in there noting down like, oh, if you go to like this borough, they have this plant like growing on the green. So there's still a sense of like they're working with the landscape they have.
So fascinating. Yeah, Mary Parish is such a wonderful example, and we don't have a copy of that book. No, that's gone, is it not?
I believe so. Yeah. Frances Timbers has the study on her,
right?
And her ghost butler, George Whitmore, and
you have to leave the room before I talk to this guy. It's
yeah, and the young aristocrat with gambling debts that she's either in love with and or stringing along.
Yeah.
And Timbers is as much interested in the history of gender and power as she is about magic itself. And so there's a lot of summarizing what's in the book, or the kinds of things Mary might have done from it, and some like joining the dots of like this, the operation to summon her dead lover back as a kind of ghost familiar probably does look like some version of the receiving the vows from a condemned man that we get in like in Scott's Discovery, for instance.
When we look at the rituals and the charms in some of these workbooks, do they tell us much about the times in which they lived?
Yeah, I think so. So again, there's like a lot of sense of the availability of materia for spell work. We don't see a lot of like unicorn horns or phoenix feathers, despite what like grimoire skeptics like A.E. Waite would have us believe. My biases are very clearly showing here. The
guy was an asshole. No matter which way you cut it, the guy was a dick. Some people are trying.
Don't do black magic. Here's a bunch of books about it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's like, oh, Waite said this book is terrible. I'm gonna go right there and look at these books because.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the availability of material, you also get some great studies on like pharmacists and apothecaries and like what was available. And in some cases, it's not as, especially by like the 17th century, it's not as limited as we might expect. Like they can get rare ingredients and things like that. There's a huge market for like crushed red coral, for instance, used for a variety of medical and magical things. And some fascinating like studies in lapidary and its overlaps with like apothecaries and pharmacists and druggists and stuff like that. So there's some good material history stuff in there. I think they also tell us about prevalent popular ideas and attitudes to magic and witchcraft themselves.
Yes.
As distinct from like top-down elites, like the abstractions of theologians and like the screeds of the kind of concerned citizens brigade of the religiously uptight, right? Yeah. How many common people just weren't convinced that all magic was evil or devilish, right? That cunning folk unbewitched seemed a lot more straightforward than these arguments that the devil was playing some kind of long con by making people only believe that they cured the body while in fact imperiling their immortal soul, right? There's a great example of this in George Gifford's dialogue about witchcraft, which takes the form of an imagined like dialogue and interlocution, which is very popular in continental demonologies between like a learned divine scholar and an ignorant commoner who talks like this, and oh gosh, Lord, thank you for teaching me how ignorant and stupid I was about thinking I could go to a wise woman, right? This kind of, it's even like it's very Lovecraftian in the like deliberately making them seem like inarticulate and stuff. Right. Yeah. But he has this example of towards the end of it of one of these common folk pointing out that well, when we had like when the dairy was bewitched, my wife told me to heat up an iron poker and to stick it in the dairy to get it unbewitched, which is a very popular and fairly long attested way of unbewitching something. Like red hot iron does a lot. And they're like, well, obviously this is witchcraft. And then the good wife actually like turns up in the dialogue and it's like, what's all this you're saying? And they're like, isn't that witchcraft? And she's like, no, it's anti-witchcraft. Are you crazy? And they try and goad her and are like, well, do you think the devil can be compelled by a mere iron spit? And she's like, well, I mean, I don't know about that, but he didn't come back. Right. Like this sense of like, I just work here, man, is I think really important. They try and like convince them that they're doing a bad thing, and clearly Gifford's intention is to show that this good wife is ignorant of things that she should be considering. But I think on reflection, she comes off looking better than they do, right?
Yeah.
Staying practical.
Yeah.
It's like, I did the thing and the thing worked and the butter churns just fine now.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of examples we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in this episode, but I like for a few of these workbooks, the switch from the Catholic beliefs in England to the Protestant beliefs was, of course, anybody that knows anything about history, particularly of this period of time, will know just how tumultuous it was. But that's also reflected in some of these workbooks, where it's like some of the older spells that have very Catholic elements to them, you can sense them starting to switch over to the Protestant way of putting these forward. And that's to me is eminently fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do these things come to be in collections, and what kind of people saved them? You mentioned Elias Ashmole, but how did they go from being just, and maybe we don't know the answer for this, and this might just be speculation, but how do we get to have these things in, say, Oxford libraries or the collections at the British Museum or the British Library? Like how do they get there?
Well, in some cases we've got like Elias Ashmole, who is both like an antiquarian and also like a practicing astrological magician.
Yeah.
C.H. Joston did a lot of great work translating some of his enciphered journals, which show that he was like casting sigils and all sorts of like not just charts about his marital troubles, but also trying to make sigils, especially like biplanetary ones, interestingly, as well as casting quote sigils of like mice and other pests to keep them out of his kitchen, in saturnine and martial kind of conditions. So he was like doing stuff with these things. Also very interested in alchemy and veering in and out of how practical and how kind of spiritual that was. Well, he was also an antiquarian. He was also interested in like cultivating this sense of the various different lineages of English magic. Very, again, Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange kind of stuff. We've also got magicians passing stuff on to other magicians to some degree. We've also got weird book collectors as well, who are interested in these as kind of novelties, and they get bound together. We get some early historians of science that are also interested in like, yes, they're gonna compile all these weird alchemy things into stuff to get at the eventual history of chemistry and stuff like that. A lot of the Sloane manuscripts were, at least when I was going over to Oxford, in the Radcliffe Science Library, for instance. So yeah, worth pointing out that like there've been interests in history and antiquity and in the practices, as well as like certain degrees of what we might call like early folkloristics as well, like Thomas Brown's kind of stuff, which is as much about dismissing popular observances and beliefs as it is about connecting them up to wider mythic threads and things like that. We also just straight up sometimes find them coming to light as people clear out their attics,
right?
And like find like great granddad's book of sheep cures, which also, in the midst of all of this like medical stuff, has a bunch of things that are just like outright charms. Again, especially in like Sweden and Norway.
It's happening in and around Pennsylvania as well. There's a few
right
that they're finding not just copies of the long lost friend. They're finding like actual Hexenmeister books. But those are just being saved, or they go to private collections. Boo. We'll get them. What can we do? Or the Vatican shows up with some people. Give them to us. It's like, what are you doing here in Pennsylvania? No. There's another movie. I've just got Netflix series everywhere. Here we go. I don't even have Netflix. There's a big disclaimer for everybody.
Well, you don't have to have it to pitch to them, I guess.
Fair enough. True. I hope that's not the first question they ask you. Is like, do you have Netflix? No. It's like, Trapdoor opens. There you go.
First hurdle. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. What can you do? Let's talk a little bit about some of the books that influenced some of these magician workbooks. And I know we've talked about this before. Most likely we talked about it in the first time you showed up on the show talking about grimoires. But how essential were books like the Pseudo-Agrippan fourth book of Occult Philosophy and the book that we've talked about a little bit in this episode, Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft? How important were these books to magicians' workbooks?
I think just in terms of like what material we have from the working books we have, like they're really influential, like, but there are whole sections of them. There are instances of, in the same way that, Owen Davies has pointed out, when we have evidence of something called a cavicula Salomonis in like a witch trial or the kinds of, like, when it comes to legal court business, we don't necessarily know exactly what's in there because Key of Solomon becomes just it's a brand recognition thing, right? Or over recognition. We also see that a little bit with Agrippa's books called an Agrippa, especially in France in the 16th century. And there's a whole bunch of like law that crops up around how they have to be bound in chains and like hung from the rafters of a barn and things like that, and that we shouldn't open them because all sorts of sorcerer's apprentice stuff might happen. But we also see things like the cunning folk again in Pennsylvania in the late 17th century, like the Roman brothers in Chester County, who come a cropper of the magistrates and are said to have a copy of Scott's Discovery, a copy of Hayden's Theomagia, which is all about like angelology and geomancy, and Agrippa's teaching nigromancy, which is almost certainly sections of the fourth book, which do indeed have a bunch of stuff about how to do a variety of things that get called black magic, how to summon the souls of the dead, and what to do about that, as well as like more practical theorizing on how you would construct pentacles, planetary magic, all sorts of things like that. So there's whole sections of them turn up in Gauntlet, in Rawlinson 253. And in various other places as well. So they really are like very influential. Scott's Discovery isn't just a collection of charms and things. There is a whole section that is meant to be a working book as well, the Secretum Secretorum of TR, which is, again, looks pretty practical.
Yeah. You know what? This is not on track, but I have to ask you, because I got you here and it's going to make its way into the episode. Who do you think put the extra appendices in Scott's Discovery? Because those, like the interesting stuff. Because when people ask me, like, I bought Discovery of Witchcraft and it doesn't have any of the stuff that you talked about. It's like, well, I think the editions that are being put out now, I believe Dover has one of them. I'm not trying to shit on Dover Publishing, but the appendices aren't in that version. There's other versions a bit later on, as Dr. Al has mentioned, where more magic gets put in the appendices. Who do you think was putting that in there?
Well, we can know for sure who's taken that stuff out, which is Montague Summers,
right?
Who's this 20th century witch hunter, basically. Like, he's adamant that like the commie socialist witches are going to take over the world. And so we need to exercise all the cool stuff out of Scott's Discovery.
Right.
In looking at like what the sources are for like the discourse of spirits and devils and things like that at the end, which is especially in like the 1665 edition of Scott's Discovery, there's actually a bunch of material. Alan Thorogood's pointed this out from what looks to be taken from Casaubon's True and Faithful Relation, which is fascinating to me in terms of the idea of like a bunch of what we would now call Enochian magic finding its way into these both folk and like folk grimoiric expressions. Like some of the spirits, because there are some spirit lists in that discourse, seem to be taken from names from the tables, from Dee's tables and stuff like that. So they're drawing on like actual source work, and crucially, as Thorogood's pointed out, like Casaubon's version, not necessarily directly having Dee's stuff, because they're of like some of the mistypes or some of the particular ways that names are spelled or whole passages are copied out and things like that. So again, it looks like maybe true and faithful relation wasn't just a character assassination of the good Dr. D, that like a lot of people, again, like Scott's Discovery, treated it as like, tell me more about this fascinating and forbidden magic that I shouldn't do.
Right. That's fascinating. Yeah, the appendices or the later person. I don't even know if they're appendices in this Discovery of Witchcraft, but the later stuff is just incredibly fascinating to me. It's
and again a mixture of like what are spirits like,
like
what are they made of, how do they work, how are they different. Again, has a bunch of stuff about like, oh sure, there's some unclean spirits and technically devils, but like you can do good stuff with them.
Right. Definitely. I have to ask you, and hopefully this doesn't put you on the spot, but with your years of looking at these magicians' notebooks, is there a personal note or some bit of scrawl in one of these things that just absolutely tickles your fancy? You're like, man, this is the weirdest, wackiest, but coolest little note that I've ever seen in one of these books. Is there one that you can maybe give us an example of?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's some really fascinating examples of like what they choose to copy out and how they frame it.
Right.
Again, the way people copy out demon, not just out of daimon or daemon, but back into it as well, and devil especially as well. And where as a result, we get phrasings like good devils, which is obviously, like I say, obviously, which is fascinating to me as you know, someone that's interested in doing good work with occasionally shady spirits. You also see a bunch of Protestant magicians adapting Catholic magic, sometimes writing out the whole Catholic rite and then scribbling parts out and writing things like popishness in the margins. Which is like, who are you writing this for? Like, which is also a legit question.
Would it be one of those? Would you think it'd be one of those things that if somebody got a hold of one of these people, they would take a look in these books, and do you think that they would think that they would be? Because I know that for a fact that some of the stuff that was probably ripped out of the magical treatise, the Hygromantia, was probably, particularly the pinning of the Black Demon, was like, there's a part where it's like, this was just completely taken out, and most likely it was because if they were caught with that book, it would be like, oh, that's an immediate hanging right there. Like,
sure, yeah, there's a certain amount of self-preservation, right? And we definitely have a lot of examples of some of the more magically inclined practitioners after D and that whole debacle being very, very careful and even possibly like deliberately burning a bunch of their notes and things like that. So I don't think that's out of bounds to kind of think about in those terms. I also think it's interesting, the process of like, I'll copy it out for myself and then work out which parts I'm going to adapt. So this mindset of not just immediately being like, I don't care about this stuff, I'm just copying out something spooky or cool, of like, no, I am taking care in my craft, right?
Yeah. Fascinating. Oh, these things are so interesting. Now let's move to the part that I'm sure that everybody listening to this show really wants us to get to, which, let's go through some examples of magicians' workbooks. And the first one would be the Cambridge Book of Magic. What's interesting about this document, Dr. Al?
So for a start, it looks more like a compendium. It looks less like a step-by-step, certainly. It's, you know, it's not actually 93, but there are 93 entries. Some of them we don't have. And it looks more like a collection of spells on the one hand, the magical experiments. It's been dated to like the first half of the 16th century. Francis Young has done some really great work on it. And he points out that it's a text in transition that he says stands at that boundary you were just talking about between medieval clerical necromancy and a developing kind of composite magic characteristic of the 16th century. And is it I think like, yeah, there's been a real sense of like, yeah, Clarkson talking about like the self-conscious production of a book that looks magical was a kind of new development in the 16th century, and will eventually lead to the 17th century's like predominance of being really into like formal Solomonic stuff for a while, or at least some types of practitioners. What's interesting about it is that on the one hand, these are discrete experiments. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of intratextuality of like, there'll be an experiment that will be like, okay, you need like exorcised water for this. And there will be notes in there being like, oh, refer back to page whatever in this book where I detail how to exorcise water. Yeah. So the experiments are separate, but they're linked up. And in looking at those links, you do see like a coherence of a personal practice of some kind. You also see, again, a strong emphasis on like thief detection and some love magic and stuff, and at least one experiment that definitely has the language that says it's performed on behalf of a client. It's the spirit Enoi or Enoi. I conjure you that you show me or us suitably which possession of this man was stolen and the place in which it may truly be found. Right. And it's that case we were talking about where Jung kind of suggests that maybe if it is Paul Foreman's text, that's the name, the Foreman text is part of the additional manuscript 3544 from Cambridge Library, that this mixture of learned necromancy and more simple recipes might represent that it was put together by an ex-monk or an ex-friar who was trying to deploy his knowledge as a cunning person. Although he's like, he admits this is speculation. But it definitely shows that there's some evidence of this stuff being used for others. And again, it's a really great, not just a miscellany, but a linked up collection that shows like, okay, this part was used here, this part was used here. So if you're aware of how someone was probably flipping backwards and forwards, and even there seems some sections where they leave pages for things and then fill them in later. It's a really great example of like, not just a list of spells, but of how someone was actually using them.
Definitely. And I will say this, you can go to the store and you can grab a copy of the Cambridge Book of Magic. Francis Young's introduction, there's so much great stuff in that. Like it's,
my gosh. Yeah.
I'm a fan of magic first and foremost. I wish, to my knowledge, this is the only thing that the only translation that Francis has done of a book of magic. He talks about exorcism and fairies, and I love all of Francis. Every time Francis releases a book, I buy it. But this man, his eyes and his unique way of noticing details and what he shares in the introduction to his translation is worth the price of admission alone.
Yeah, the way he dates it to like composed between 1532 and 1539 is like so specific. And it's not just like spurious rigor. He analyzes the talk of the currency in a spell to get money, where he's like, it's English money and another term for like a Welsh kind of currency. And he's like, this was around between this time and this time. So it can't have been earlier than this, but it can't have been later than this.
Yeah.
The detail is incredible. He's done the Medieval Book of Magical Stones as well, which is less a magical handbook, but certainly has a bunch of stuff about like magical, the Peterborough Lapidary.
Okay.
Awesome. Amazing scholarship.
Definitely. Yeah. Francis is, again, another one of those scholars that I wish we had 10 more. Francis. So great. I love everything he does. Let's talk about a book that you had a hand in sharing with the world. So what is the excellent book on the art of magic as well as visions?
This is a mid 16th century text, 1567, that I worked on with my good friend and colleague, Phil Legard. Which is the details of the operations of this operator and scryer, which is almost certainly Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies, who over the course of this spring into the rest of the year conjure a bunch of dead magicians to turn up and tell them how to do magic properly, and also have a variety of fascinating like visionary experiences, both in and apparently out of the show stone or show stones that they were using. And one of the other reasons that this is it's a grimoire, but one of the things that we have in terms of if we're defining a working book, less so in terms of service magic, they're doing it for themselves, very much their own empowerment. Bring me more excellent books, basically. Do magic to get better at magic, to get more spirits to bring you more books, adds library space infinitum. But if we're defining it as like one that has marginalia, we're lucky enough that their appended scrying journal, which is just called The Visions, is full of accounts of how these dead magicians and these other spirits, the evangelists, especially Saint Luke, turn up and tell them to do magic that they then do in that way that then produces more results. So we have a behind the scenes of like what they were doing to receive this magic, as well as just like what they did. So we do have it as a grimoire in terms of the excellent book itself, of like the step-by-steps of how to conjure and severely threaten a bunch of spirits.
They like yelling. They like yelling.
Oh my gosh, they really do. The assumption that all spirits are going to lie to you, and so you need to be the best aggression is the best offense is a really aggressive offense, is really prevalent. It's not work I would necessarily advise people do in that manner.
Right.
And again, he's doing so much of it that one of the things that happens at a certain point is Saint Luke turns up unbidden and is like, dude, you've got to stop cursing all these spirits. Like, my gods, like the mail we're getting about this, like, right. I will be a go-between, so you don't need to like tell them that like God is going to curse them and to cast them down into a further pit of hell. Like, I'll deal with that. You can go through me. Yeah. And again, with the magician's ego that Gilbert clearly has, he's like, so you're saying I'm basically a saint too now? And they're like, yes, Gilbert, yes, you are. Yes. You're definitely not just going to die on a shipwreck because you're too like stubborn to listen to your navigators.
Yeah. If people listening to this podcast are fans of magic and grimoires and you don't yet own an excellent book on the art of magic, rectify that right now. It's an astonishing document. It's so unbelievably fascinating, and it's one of the greatest releases I've seen of a magical document in my lifetime. It's like, this is such a beautiful, and it's so well produced as well. You and Phil did such fantastic job with it.
Phil did so much great legwork in terms of digging up like the Guthrie manuscripts and other examples of the kinds of operations, particularly shedding light on like the Azazel workings, like the what Dan Harms calls like the keeper of the dry bones workings, right. Which again seemed like this really popular kind of early modern necromancy where you go to this originally fallen angel, Enochic, a fallen angel who's responsible for all sin, and at some point gets promoted to the Lord of the Dead, right. That you then like work with them or get their license to send you dead folks to teach you stuff. As well as a bunch of stuff around like the four kings, Oriens, Paimon, Maimon, and Egin, and a bunch of other spirits to do some very specific things. And again, this sense of doing magic to get better at magic.
Yeah. Also fantastic and a great example specifically for this episode, because we actually know who wrote these things, Gilbert and Davies, and you can read up about the history of these guys. Man, fascinating characters. Would not want, I believe, Davies is Humphrey Davies, not somebody I'd want to know in real life. He sounded like a real turd.
Oh yeah. Humphrey Gilbert has a terrible track record in Ireland, especially of committing atrocities.
Gilbert. Yeah.
And this is this is part and parcel for like the English colonialists that get called adventurers. Right. That they start by suppressing the Irish in particularly brutal ways. Unpleasant gentleman by all accounts. And engaged in this weird frenemy relationship at court with John Dee himself as well.
Right.
Fascinating and an unpleasant character.
Yeah, and met his end quite interestingly as well. I won't give it away, people, but it's so cool that this document exists. These documents exist, and that we know exactly who made them, composed them, and you get so much of an interesting magical story because of it. Astounding stuff. Yeah. Let's move to perhaps my favorite example of a magician's notebook. So we're going to be talking about Rawlinson MSD 253, otherwise known to the world right now as the Cunning Man's Grimoire. It can be purchased, I believe Stephen Skinner and David Rankin released an edition of it through Golden Horde. What was that? 5 years ago? Amazing stuff. What is it about this document that's so cool?
Again, it's clearly an actual working book. It shows a mixture of planetary magic, of some what it calls rural charms, so the hunting stuff, even some like gambling charms and things like that, as well as like some scrying operations, some stuff that looks like the kinds of one-off experiments from kind of goetic manuals. So rather than like a big spirit list, it's got like the experiment of Berto. It has an operation I'm particularly interested in of these 3 spirits that you call up either in your bedchamber with 3 batons. They also turn up in some other places. I find, there's some particularly interesting things and crossover with the Book of the Science of Nigromancy, where these spirits, Durus or Duvus and Artus or Arctus, turn up again and again. That like you in the Rawlinson text, you summon them into your bedchamber, and they look more like the table working of the three beautiful fairy ladies.
Right.
And they answer your questions. In the book of the Science of Nigromancy, they're willow staves that you put around a prison to get someone out of jail.
Ah.
So they do a variety of things, but they work by putting by triangulating them with these staves that you put in a place where you want them to turn up and do something. That one's also interesting because it has this wonderful, not even marginalia, it's like full on
margin notes. Yeah.
A full on what's it called, like an exhortation about how these spirits are not to be trusted.
I literally have it. I've got it ready right here. Can I read it? Here.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Beware of all evil spirits and meddle not with them, for being enemies to all mankind. If they appear either willingly or unwillingly, they are ever intent to the destruction of mankind. If they do anything for man, it is to tempt him to evil and destroy him in the end. Yet some are worse than others. Like
yeah.
He wrote that. Like he does. There's the experiment of Berto. This very notorious spirit. Everybody don't have time to go into it too much right now. But yeah, right in there, he's got a little disclaimer. He's like, by the way, everybody, I'm just writing this down for reasons.
Yeah. That one is one of the more clear examples of like if someone that one feels a lot more like he's writing that for anyone who might call him like an evil magician, right? I am not a dark wizard, right? The one for Durus and Arctus is fascinating because he's like, he doesn't know what they are.
Right.
He's like, though they come beautifully, yet there is a question what they are and of what order or place or office, whether good or evil or twixt both. Therefore, you are better advised how thou meddle with them. It is probable they are of an indifferent nature, either of the air or woods, or some same such like, which he that can and shall and will make trial of the experiment might by faith and some words constrain them to tell or signify what they are and of whence and what kind. So he's like, I don't know what these are, but like, I guess we're gonna have to talk to them to work that out.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I know everybody must be rolling their eyes right now. I'm going to read another thing here because such a treasure trove of this kind of thing. And it's why I love it so much, because the personality comes through very, very clearly of the kind of person that had this. But at the end of the Berto experiment, he also has this thing called the admonition of the artist, where he says, this experiment may be proved, but still my advice is to prove nor make use of none of the good but good angels, which are holy. For I am a Christian and fear the true God, and have known and seen more than all common men in my youthful time, and more curious days. So do I abhor the way of any conjurations, and therefore have written these things without any such way, knowing that by prayer and faith all good things may be obtained of the true omnipotent God in the name of Jesus Christ, and et cetera, et cetera. It's just like...
Right. So he starts to get into kind of conjurational language, even in his own like marginalia.
Right. Oh my goodness. It's such a fascinating thing. And I remember, it's Golden Horde, and I love David and I love Stephen, but I was like, man, that seems like a lot to pay for, like, I don't know, it was like a 200-page book, but since it's worth its weight. I love flipping through it. It's fantastic. There's some really great operations there for angel interactions as well. It's one of my favorite things, and I absolutely love the Cunning Man's Grimoire.
Yeah. There's also some really interesting stuff around the magic rings of what it calls the lunar mansions,
right?
Which again, it has sometimes been classified as a very like elite kind of knowledge set, and shows that like these had remarkably a mixture of really practical purposes and very illusion-based practices. I had a really great chat with my friend and colleague Jehan Mahmoudi, who's just published a book on the lunar stations, which includes some study of these rings themselves. It does a huge cross-cultural comparison of how lunar stations and mansions turn up in a variety of like Arabic and Islamic texts, as well as a bunch of other stuff. And it's beautiful poetry. I really recommend people check it out. But also gives a context for like what's going on with some of these illusions. The fact that like an experiment to make a magic ring to make a dragon appears to have a bunch of context in the draconic mythology and magic of that particular mansion or station, and things like that. And just shows that like people were doing practical stuff with a variety of astrologies that might not have seemed terribly available to folk.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as a grimoire that I think has a lot of practical value in it, the Cunning Man's Grimoires is right up there. There's some really interesting near plug and play stuff. And as I mentioned, to angels specifically, there's a kind of like an angel it's a step by step. Truly, it's like the days of the week, and it's got you this. This is what you do. You go in this order, and it's incredible.
Yeah, flowcharty. Yeah.
Basically, it's great. Highly recommend everybody. Let's talk about two grimoires kind of together, because you can find a translation of both of these workbooks in a work called Making Magic in Elizabethan England by one of my favorite people in the world, Frank Clausen. So there's two books in there. There's the Antiphoner Notebook or Antiphoner Notebook, as well as the Boxgrove Manual. Why do you think that these are fascinating documents and to be included in magicians' workbooks?
Well, again, say like the Boxgrove Manual does show that there's this like blend of medieval and Renaissance sources going on here. The stuff that especially fascinates me is the work with planetary cameo or number squares, and the kind of tables and sigils as a metallic item that is impressed with a bunch of things. It's also, I think, Boxgrove that starts to get into sigillated cakes as well, right? This stuff is fascinating. So the idea that you would engrave a plate and then be able to construct these doughy mixtures of various planetary ingredients, including incense and various like ground up powders and stuff, and then you would press them to the engraving to make these things that are called sigillated cakes. Which is not an uncommon way of like making lozenges for incense and stuff like that. But these have a variety of properties where like they contain some value of the table itself, but are used in a fungible manner. So like the one for using the Jupiterian 4x4 square, you can bit it up into powder and scatter it about a place where you want there to be peace or negotiations. You can make several of the cakes and put them in places for protection against lightning. And again, they really demonstrate that like this kind of metallurgy was not just about having fancy gear. It was also about like actually applying through this very literal, like impressing parts of the engraved number square onto an impressionable material that you could then use as a powder, as a variety of things like that. I think that's Boxgrove, right? I'm not getting confused here.
Yep. No, that's Boxgrove.
Yeah. So, and again, that's partly from like Belinus and things like that. Again, texts that like we might not have thought that working and service magicians had access to. Again, they're for things that like people wanted doing. And then the Antiphona has like a bunch of stuff, including, prayers against thieves and witches. And again, demonstrates this way that certain work against the infiltration of, in the medieval period, more like revenants and like bad ghosts, starts to then be employed to work with other people that might sneak into your house and do you harm, witches, their imps, as well as thieves, and all sorts of operations to protect yourself, as well as spoil, a very technical term for like aggressive magical counter attacks.
Right. Yeah. The Antiphoner, the Antiphoner, whatever we're going to, again, when I mentioned everybody, the pronunciation is going to be a terrible, at least from my end for this one. It's a lot more charmy than if you was one to look at the Boxgrove Manual. It looks a little bit more like a little bit more Solomonic. There's some diagrams in there of circles and stuff of that variety, but that's right. Yeah, the antiphoner, who knows what it is? The AN, very
that one.
Yeah, very interesting document. These two documents show that when the Protestant Reformation was occurring in England, they're very indicative of this really turbulent time and the changing of language and how it's being used. And Frank Clausen does a really great job in the introduction to his book, Making Magic in Elizabethan England, where he's like, this is where magic in England and in the West specifically stops being like part and parcel with organized religion and starts becoming opposed to it, and you can just kind of see that there. I love the AN, how there's a charm in there on how to make a talisman, I believe, or an amulet. And in the person who's writing it or creating this notebook says that this is the charm that was used to protect this one person so that they wouldn't be executed, but they got the history totally wrong. The name that is used is Robert Tresilian, who was somebody who was hung and then their throat was cut in 1388. There's a story in some book that was written way after this of him being brought up to the scaffolding and being like, you can't kill me because I'm wearing these magical amulets. And then they like just take his cloak off and remove the amulets and then hang him up and then cut his like incredible stuff. But in this magical notebook, they're like, by the way, this famous person that was executed had this charm that I'm writing down in this book.
That's what survives, right? That's what survives in the folk memory, that thing is possible.
Yeah.
And that like you might have access to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible. Again, these things are so fascinating to me. It's just, and I hate to say it, and this sounds like we're just bigging up all of these scholars. If you're unaware of Frank Clausen's work, it's exceptional. His introductions, the book Transformations of Magic, the work he does with Sharon Hubbs Wright, such a gift that these scholars are working and producing these things. I just absolutely love it. Whenever they released, it's an instant purchase from me. It's like, yep.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Great titles as well, right? Like absolutely. Magic of Rogues, Everyday Magicians.
That book, I mean, that book alone was my favorite, maybe one of my favorite, probably the best thing released since your the excellent book on the art of magic, The Magic of Rogues. I think I first heard about it from you, actually. And it was like, oh, by the way, there's these guys.
I was very excited, yeah.
There's these guys that try to find treasure using Oberon. And I was like, it has part of the trial transcripts in there, as well as the magic that they used. And I was like, that's an instant purchase and so great. So amazing. Let's move to the Mac Daddy here, which is the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet.
Oh, Uncle Arthur. Yeah. This is again a really great work edited by David Rankin so Gauntlet is operating in around the 1650s at Gray's Inn Lane in London, and I think this is one of the really extra fantastic eloquent examples of a truly working book. There are excerpts from, like we said, Scott's Discovery from the fourth book. There's the whole Arbitel in there. There's extracts of and reordered form of the Heptameron so that it makes sense to him. Right. There's a bunch of like charms, whether for against enemies, against witches, spell operations of like some of the more formal unbewitching stuff. All sorts of examples of psalm magic. Like practical stuff you can do with psalms. There's again gambling charms. There's stuff against toothache. There's ways to harvest herbs to work magically with them, as well as all this stuff with vervain. The 18 apple spells for some very lusty kind of work, as well as some like occult philosophical treatises on the nature of things. Like the Instructions of Cyprian we talked about, and like extracts of the fourth book and other bits and pieces like that. And again, just the manner, very similar to how you were talking about with the flowchart of a Cunning Man's grimoire, right. The modular nature of the evocatory scrying exercises, where it's based off the three good angels that you have in the glass, which has some scriptural basis, but the idea that you get your stone cooking with angelic gas, and then you plug in a bunch of different conjurations depending on what you want them to show you, and especially the operations then shift to another modality when you want them to actually do stuff, when you want to not just know where did this client's cattle that are lost wander off to, but to get them to return, to actually affect stuff, not just have knowledge at a distance. And there's some really practical stuff in there. There's a whole thing about scrying the dirt of a place to discover either treasure or secrets that are there, which is like partly like a Field in England type stuff. He says you get like a sod of turf and you put it like under the glass of water, literally glass of water that you're scrying in, like a wine glass with a stem. And you hold it up to the light. And so there's a lot of stuff about like the practicality of how you actually do this scrying. But then he also says like, oh, you could get like, some dirt from like a room to see what's going on there. So like, this isn't just about having, Empyrean angelical experiences that might tell you something. It's also about like keeping eyes on things.
Mm-hmm. Who was Arthur Gauntlet?
So he's a cunning man, again, around Gray's Inn Lane. We don't know that much about his life. We know that he worked, at least for a while, with a scryer called Sarah Skelton, who was regarded as having some of the best eyes in the business. And that they made an odd pair in that Gauntlet was meant to be pretty bawdy and a little bit of a dodgy character. He's professing physic in Lily's terms, and there is some like medical stuff in there, but he's primarily a magical geezer. And then Skelton seems to be a very pious kind of girl who has a connection to or plagued by a bunch of fairies, especially the queen of the pygmies. And so they have this strange kind of working relationship. But again, a lot of what we have in there is like what he chose to write down and how he chose to frame it. He does seem to have this like devotion to Saint Cyprian in some sense, as a magician's saint. Or other kind of features of it we can kind of extrapolate from. He sometimes names some of the people he got some charms from, Captain Bub and things like that. Right. He's a fascinating customer.
Definitely. So let's put you on the spot one more time. Of all of these examples that we've gone through, is there one that you'd say that really best typifies a magician's workbook for maybe some of the listeners who might be really new to the idea of that we have magicians workbooks, that you'd say like put eyes on this one first, and then you can look at some of the other ones? Is there one? Is it Arthur Gauntlet, you think?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I've got personal biases. I have been working with the shade of Arthur Gauntlet for a good while, since I managed to summon him from the dirt to the seven crossroads of Gray's Inn Lane, or road as was. I think it's a great example of a bunch of the things we've been talking about: the modularity of operations, the capacity for experimentation, the simplicity of some of the stuff, the way he frames it, the way it shows whole Grimoire text and parts of Grimoire texts. And I think it's something that can really inspire people, showing parts of the whole Grimoires and what they can do, these ranges of charms, the application of psalms, the healing works. And some of the formulary as well, especially some of the simple stuff around like counter magic.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's actually fairly available. I think it's still being reprinted. You can find a copy of it fairly easily. And everybody find the version. Don't just go online, because I think there was one that was put out, like a really dodgy, like not good. I might be wrong about this, but find the one edited by David Rankin, everybody. To get the one that David Rankin did. David Rankin is another individual. I wish we had 4,000 of them. But yeah, just really great, excellent work all the time. So here's the thing. Something which I meant to ask you on the very first episode I had you on, which was the Grimoires episode, is this: how would you respond to many people, particularly skeptics, who say that grimoires and even these things like magicians' notebooks are just merely some kind of strange literary convention? A good example that most people these days would be able to recognize would be something like a choose your own adventure book or something like that, which were really popular for a time and now are not as popular anymore. But that grimoires and magicians' workbooks they're just a literary convention. That there's just something that people thought were fun and a novelty and were kind of cool. And even something like Visions by Gilbert and Davies, that this was just a work of fiction, that all of these things are just works of fiction. How would you respond to something like that?
Well, without being too defensive, but if I'm allowed to be a little flippant here, I think saying that something is like a literary convention and just kind of, it was just trendy is a little bit, smacks of a little bit of hipsterism, right? I think a thing can be popular and also good.
Imagine that.
So look, like the study of both like folk magic and grimoire magic shows pretty clearly that there's a lot of give and take between them, and especially from popular practices into more formal conjuration, like we talked about with the various keys of Solomon, kind of incorporating, shall we say, more folk operations. Like, because let's be real, if it works, some book wizard is going to shove in extra names of God, drawing a circle and wearing a funny hat to do it, and might even have the gumption to call that the only proper way to do it, right? So I'm all for pricking some of the pomposity of this like crown of creation model, right? But I think what I'm saying is that like approaches to magic don't exist in vacuums or neat, mutually exclusive pigeonholes. Right. I mean, not always, at least. So if this is a point about grimoires being a literary convention, if that's about it not being worth studying grimoires at all, I'd say they have a lot to tell us about magic in general and how it was thought to work. I'd also say it's worth us taking seriously the claims of some grimoires, like the Grimorium Verum, of being the protocols that the spirits themselves have either volunteered or at least agreed to, right? I don't think this has to mean like a purist approach of like everything this book says is the word of God, let alone Solomon. But I think it does again mean taking seriously that these are partially records of human spirit interactions about what's possible or even preferential. That said, if this is, a comment about saying it's not worth thinking about grimoire magic as a completely separate category of sorcery, I've got a lot of time for that.
Yeah. The number one thing that I particularly have with it happens less so with scholars, but just people that don't know too much about magic in general, is that, they just basically say like, these are curiosities that were, just for a time people thought it was fun. And then there were the blue grimoires and people thought those were fun. And the shitty urban or rural folk just, they couldn't even read, but they would just have it as like a talisman. And that is the be all and end all of their existence. Period.
Right.
Moving on.
And sure, they get sold as novelties, like as Cecil Williamson would say, like, and it still happens to this day, right? But there is something around privilege going on here, and saying like you get to think that they're nonsense because you don't need them, right? Like, what did people rely on when the chips were down, right? What are you willing to be like? I'm not being ignorant, I'm not being gullible, but I am looking at my options that are currently very limited. And what can I get to work?
Definitely. Yeah. Magic has been such a huge part of the human experience. And as somebody who believes in magic personally, I think it's actually one of those things that it works. I've seen it work in my life. But that people spent so much time on these things for something that is a novelty, right? That doesn't make sense to me. Right? And skepticism being that flippant and that easy to do is just, it doesn't wash. It doesn't make any kind of sense in the regard that these things are important to people. As you said, when the chips are down, you really start to see where people gravitate their interests, and a pragmatism takes over. And a lot of times that gets translated into books and into things like grimoires and magicians' notebooks and workbooks. To this day, I've got one. When I die, please give my work to the Ashmole Museum. They'll take it, right? Like,
hell yeah.
Do you have personal notebooks? I just got to ask, like, because
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Arguably too many. No, I take a lot. I'm really into like book arts and like altered books, and putting pockets in them. Again, doing a lot of work with the Book of the Science of Nigromancy, which works off groups of working spirits, chapters they call them. So you don't have individual sigils for the spirits; you have a collection of glyphs, and they fit neatly on these kinds of. They're meant to be made of bits of parchment that look a bit like big bookmarks. And so some of my working books have like little envelopes kind of taped into them. I've been getting into bookbinding of late, and so like making my own working books as well. So like, making sure that the thread that I'm binding the pages with has been soaked in various like oils and things like that. That there are things written in the book boards that are then covered by the end papers and stuff like that. I think we can, even if they're not, we talk about that a lot in terms of the Liber Spiritums of like this book is now haunted, is now possessed. But I think there's a bunch of ways that we can empower even our reference material. I think that's super important. I think I often recommend, if people are working a particular grimoire, to copy it out themselves, and even to consider copying it out in a different order. It shouldn't just be like you got to do your lines right, and you have to copy it all out because you have to suffer for your art. It's about like understanding it and working out. Like, it makes more sense for me to talk about the first thing you do. It makes more sense perhaps to talk about the preparations before you do the first thing, and how you order it. It helps you engage with it, and also arguably helps you, especially if it's a if you're planning to work with spirits, it gives a sense of getting to know them.
Have you given any consideration as to what you would like to have happen with these notebooks? I've started to think about it. It's like, do I donate do I leave something in my will where it's like, please donate to so and so museum?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about something like that? Like,
which parts do I want to burn? Which part, do I want burned? Which,
Oh, there's some that are definitely going in the wood chipper. Yeah, there's definitely some ones, but like there's other stuff that's like, man, it's too bad that I'm the only one that has eyes on these, because this might help some people further.
No, I think that's very important. With the passing of my friend Jake Stratton Kent, a little while ago, like a lot of his stuff was passed on to the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, and so we now have some of his like tools and spirit pots and stuff that I only saw in his spirit room when I went to visit him, right, that are now have a lot more eyes on. And one of the things about passing and joining the ancestors is that a lot of your work gets to be a matter of an engagement with it, and of like what people then do with it. It's a serious concern, right, for thinking about how to be a good ancestor, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And part of me is also just like, is that egotistical? Like, is that egotistical?
I don't think it has to be, right? I think it can, like, if you're not doing it as a like, I was this important, right? This is my great contribution. Like, behold my works and tremble, right? If it's like, I want to be helpful, right? And I want to show my notes. And if people want to realize that was a really dumb thing I did for that year or two, then that's also helpful, right? I think there's a generosity there, and I think there's a sense of being part of a linked up. I don't want to say like a particular lineage, like an initiation thing, but a flow and a continuum of practice, and keeping the things that can inspire the next sets of generations, or can make them right in spite of how much they hate that thing, right? I don't think that's inherently egotistical, to try and leave the world in a better place than when you found it.
100%. So I'm going to switch the gears here. I know this sounds a bit odd, but something that I've noticed is that when I sometimes feel really off when I use certain books or practices and certain rituals from other people's personal workbooks. It seems very tailored in a "that's not for you" sort of way. I came across this very much so when I was trying to engage in what's called "quote unquote" Enochian magic. It just, something about it to me was just like, this is not for me. Like, and this is, it's not that it's like, this is beyond your understanding, or maybe it was, because truly D was a brilliant, D was D. He was such a fascinating character, although a little bit, in some regards, I think he was a little bit naive. But what do you think about such feelings? Like, should we be using other magicians' workbooks and the rituals within these?
Well, I don't think this sounds odd at all, mate. I think it's part and parcel of kind of what we've been discussing about, like, considering yourself as being as existing in history, right? And I think it can be a feeling that helps us consider what is best practice, what is like respectful reception, what's custody of what's been transmitted. And I honestly think we can get real folk necromantic about this kind of stuff, right? I think sometimes there are things that aren't for us, definitely. And that spidey sense of like, this doesn't feel like, not because I can't do it, but maybe for some reason I shouldn't, right? Is sometimes going to be a helpful feeling, right? Sometimes that call's coming from inside the house where you're like, I am making a decision for myself and my integrity, whatever, however that means. It could be, various spirits being like, we can do other things instead. If wisdom is knowing when to duck, that sense of like, maybe not, is helpful to know when not to, right? When not to do a thing. I would say, though, that there is a sense, and we touched on this already, that some of these workbooks are partly being compiled not so much for another reader, like a gift or a product or an apprentice necessarily, but as a magician's perspective, maybe for the ages in some sense.
Yeah.
I think if we can cite our work and cite other people's work and give thanks to, and even more practically, like attend to the magical ancestors who came before us, I think that the concern can be a good and generative one, and I don't think it has to become a worry that we're stealing or faking being someone else that we're not, right? They built on the work of others, and we can respectfully do the same. And in that, I think we can understand ourselves as part of this ongoing process, part of a shared and continuing human endeavor. And I think of magic as in part a set of traditions of innovation and of like varying and experimental applications of craft logics, certainly more than just rote or dogmas, right? And I think this is where actual ancestral work and not just veneration of dead magicians can really come in and be something that like nourishes and inspires our practices, more than it just being like a kind of dutiful like gratitude debt or the borrowing of like scholarly affectations in like properly footnoting something. I used to debate with Jake a lot about footnotes. He was an autodidact who left school in his early teens, and he had a context for them as like, if not outright pretentious, then distracting from the writing at hand. And like, to be fair, they can be a kind of showing off, right? Or they can be beating people over the heads with the 800 texts you have to read before you can criticize me, bro, right?
Right.
But I also think footnoting can show that they can be like beautiful links in this flowing chain of transmission, and an honoring and a demonstration of your foundations that others can not only follow but blaze fresh paths from, right? It's showing your working. And sure, like that can be employed a little deceptively or a little like with grandiosity, but they can also be about being generous and open and honest in our communications, and an understanding that no wizard is an island, right? I think in showing our working, again, we also have this sense of like, biases of ideology are what we do when we don't know we're doing it, and of being open to the possibility that you've got something wrong and that someone else can check your work and even check you isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. And so I think by extension, there's something here about magic not being about great men of history, but like countless toiling folks who are just getting by and doing the best they could through some profound weirdness. We're lucky to have the names in the texts that we do, and we can honor them by keeping some things in the currency of practice and their names in circulation, right? So I think if folks are worried about using some dead magician's magic, like, again, as a necromancer, I'm going to say, well, why not try and talk to them, right? Now, saying like what better source than the author can be a tiny bit naive sometimes, right? Sometimes authors, I've said all I can usefully say in the book, read what I wrote, right? But it can also be really helpful. And in that case, it's about not turning your necromancy into annoying fan mail, right? There's a Taoist practice that my friend Peter von Laken was telling me about, where I think it's called like vermilion letters. It's for resolving inconsistencies and ambiguities in Grimoire constructions, where you write an essay to the ancestors and the magicians that were working this stuff and the powers detailing the source material, and you write out the disparity and what you're choosing to do about it with these supposedly mutually exclusive instructions. And again, you show your workings and you're like, I have filed the celestial paperwork as best I can to my ability. This is what I've chosen to do. If I'm wrong, come to me with a vision and tell me how I can do better by the magicians that came before me. If folks aren't sure where to begin with that kind of necromancing, beginning with patron powers can be helpful. We talked about like the Azazel stuff. There's other examples, Lords and Ladies of the Dead, St. Cyprian, plenty of spirits teach necromancy. I think more directly to the point about like a sense of unease when we try and engage with other people's magic. many of the dead magicians I talk to are kind of grumpy,
Yeah.
and they can be better at telling you what not to do, or
Right.
better at telling me what not to do. Sometimes as I'm doing it,
Right.
Because again, sometimes I'm wrong-headed. But again, like mastering a craft is about learning to be okay with being wrong in the moment and then doing it again, hopefully better, right? And better, and again and again and again, right? And being bad at something is the first step of getting better at it, right? Disapproval about what you're doing isn't necessarily saying it's not for you at all, but maybe there's ways you can adapt and develop, right? In contrast, some dead magicians I work with are very enthusiastic in a way that might be not what I want either, right? Arthur Gauntlet was a lot when I first summoned him. He was very much larger than life character, like dodgy, filthy jokes, going off and doing a bunch of work I didn't ask him to do, that sometimes made my life better and sometimes made it harder. And it took time and negotiation and some boundaries. And we have a pretty great working relationship now. Feels weird to talk about someone you work with in this kind of sense. I'm not telling on you, Uncle Arthur, I promise. One of the things I used and continue to use with Arthur is the ashes of modern copies of his grimoire, not burned as a like screw your work, man, but as a like materialization of its magic and his influence. So like that was a long ramble, sorry, but like hooray for generative necromancy of dead magicians.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. I want people to go back and re-listen to that because there's so much in there to really take apart. I love the idea of keeping these in the currency of practice and being part of that continuum, because a lot of these notebooks that we get, and we've said this before, but a lot of these notebooks, what we get is that it's not just one person's notes sometimes in there. It's at least, some of them, at least four people's different hands have been using these notebooks, and it's just been passed along. And we know the stories of some of them. We know absolutely nothing about other aspects of them, but pay honor to that. Pay that some mind that a lot of times these actual physical documents that we have been part of that process of everybody adding their bit, and you engaging in it. You're doing the same. You're adding your bit as well.
Yeah, it becomes a commonality rather than an opposition between you and some like historical source or ancestor. Yeah,
definitely. So we're coming close to the end here. What can people gain from not only being curious and studying these workbooks, but also perhaps attempting some of the rituals or the charms and the things in them?
I think there's definitely material that can arguably be more easily incorporated into your magical practice than other more systematic grimoires, precisely because they assume you'll do the usual kind of prep and opening and closing and so on. They're not always part of a system with potentially system specific ways of doing things. And I think there's also an appreciation of working shorter with stuff that's less difficult to acquire. And also I think starting simply also means that we're able to keep better track of variables if things don't go quite as smoothly or as effectively as we'd like. We have more of we haven't done 12 different alterations to the thing. We've done one, and so we can see if it doesn't work as well. Like, okay, that's the part that I'm going to need to tweak. And again, thinking about working charms or spells or operations like, at least in this kind of analogy, like learning a song, right? It's not going to be great the first time you pick up a guitar and try and play Stairway to Heaven and get kicked out of the guitar shop, right?
Denied.
Right. There's talent and there's room to be moved by the spirit and your own kind of inclination and mediumship and stuff. But those are also things we can train and become better at. And so the idea of like the craft in the cunning craft of this is, I think, important. And like giving it a go and seeing what works and what you're inspired by and moved by, I think is really useful.
Definitely. Is there kind of like a first? I know we talked about Arthur Gauntlet being a really good Porter Cole, but is there best practice, do you think, is trying to start using other people's grimoires and stuff of that variety?
I think again, kind of starting your own working book might be the first and most obvious, because then you've got a place to put it, and then you're actually physically writing stuff out, and then you're thinking about not just layout and stuff like that, but also like the choices you make as an editor, and it becomes something tangible at the end of it rather than just thinking about how you do it.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. How important would the constant process of magicians working on personalized magic and keeping record of their workings, how important has this kind of stuff been to the continuum of magic at large?
I think it's pretty vital, right? We've been talking about like the practice of being a good dead magician ourselves one day, right? Leaving records of what we did and what worked, and maybe even what didn't work is important. You know, as I kind of ranted about with the kind of the ancestral stuff. It isn't just about the past, but about keeping the flame tended and passed on. I think writing from personalized practice takes time to develop a practice, but also benefits from being able to talk about what actually works and what you changed to make work better. I think there's something of the richness of the slow cooked home meal there, right? Not just what you happened to write down, but what you worked with and lived for a good while. I think it's also important to give something forward. If what we do is worth doing, I think it's worth passing on for others to have the option who come after us to do it too. And again, I don't think this is just, it doesn't have to just be about our worldly empowerment or even our spiritual enlightenment, because again, we don't exist in vacuums. So, the question of like, what sort of future are we helping conjure, to manifestation? What's the longer term goal for what we care about? I'm a little skeptical of or suspicious of some big models of historical progress, of things like inevitably getting better. Right. But certainly there are points where we have more access to not only texts, but like conversations with other practitioners. And this is definitely one of those times. Again, communication isn't praxis, and are you doing magic or just talking about it, right? Then again, when is that conversation part of your support for doing it? And when does it distract us, right? So being connected up can also lead to more comparing our insides to other people's outsides, right? Insert rant about social media stuff, right? But there's an element of like the intersociability of humans here as well, right? These are very human things, and to identify that some difficulties. Writing from personalized practice is also a very vulnerable thing to do and put out, not just in terms of like the criticism of your dearly held stuff or your means to pay the mortgage for us like professional service magicians and magical teachers, but it's also literally showing your hand to people that might want to mess with you magically. Yeah. Right. The highest proportion of people I encounter who get enemy work thrown at them, in my experience, are public magicians and spiritual workers, usually by other workers. Right. Yes. The bigger you get, the more jealousy you might have to deal with, because humans are silly. But experimentation is also a crucial human aptitude and tendency and faculty, right? And cooperation, for that matter, as well. And just as showing our sources is, I think, like a generosity and a gratitude. So to like doing something good with them can include taking it further, exploring new ways of honoring them, even fresh applications. And this can also be like an honoring of that commonwealth of magical history and practice, or that cauldron wealth, if you will, right? Like a good teacher, wants their charges the people like that they're teaching to not just have a better time than they did, but maybe to surpass them, at least if their students choose to. So yeah, maybe more practitioners can be encouraged to leave, if not their magical notes and journals, which, as we said, can be embarrassing, but maybe outside of publishing and magical careers, maybe we should be thinking about leaving time capsuled workbooks to be shared once we joined the ancestors, And again, not recording our work just as like the grand prosperity, posterity of the ages, look how important I was, but as hopefully at least potentially useful resources for future generations of magicians and witches and weirdos to come, right? Ensuring that truly, hopefully, necromancy never dies,
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of that, and I'll just say here. There's something about looking at these documents that I find incredibly inspiring. Like I just like looking at other people's work when they're trying to engage with this kind of stuff. And I was having a conversation with one of my Patreon supporters earlier, and we were talking about teachers, and they're like, Doug, why don't you teach courses? And I think we've talked about this as well, is that I have major issues with people trying to teach magic online. Like, I'll teach you magic online. But I basically said, the best teachers compel. They don't really guide. I think the best teachers that I've had, the best things that have taught me things, are the ones that make me want to do something that I find first, and then I go with it. And looking at these books, looking at the Cunning Man's Grimoire, looking at the Cambridge Book of Magic, looking at Arthur Gauntlet, they're hugely inspiring. And I urge everybody to, while Clubviculas are nice and pretty, they're really cool. Some of them do have little notes in them and stuff like that. Take a look at something a little bit off the beaten path as far as the kind of things. Like, take a look at the Cunning Man's Grimoire. You'll recognize some stuff there, but you'll also be, and hopefully, inspired by the fact that several people thought these were useful and tried things from it, and that be inspired by them as well. So, I speaking of inspiration, you are pretty much one of the most influential people in my magical practice. If you've got eyes on something, I'm there immediately as well. You do such great work, Dr. Al. Please tell us what's going on in your world. What's happening? What's next? What's going to be the big thing? What's going on? There's big changes, small changes. Please let us into the magical world of Dr. Alexander Cummins and what's happening with you these days and going forward.
Well, I'm working on a bunch of writings at the moment. I can't say too much more about them at the moment because not just like secrets, but there's definitely a thing about like things having their incubation period, and also I just haven't finished writing them. I get not so much mission creep, but like finding new sources, being inspired, like adding things, like the slow cook being something that's more worth putting out at certain points. But I'm working on some things. Some of that stuff I'm sharing excerpts of on the old secret library of a Patreon that you kindly mentioned to folks as well. I just finished teaching, sharing inspiration, shall we say, about the grimoire I've worked with longest, the Grimorium Verum. I did a 4-part foundation course and just put the recordings of that up so folks can peruse that at their own leisure and things, rather than having to tune in on a Tuesday night. I put up some other class recordings and course series recordings on other explorations of grimoires and kind of my own kind of marginalia on them, sort of thing, pointing out useful things for folks to play with and to be aware of at the very least. And I'm planning on doing more courses and classes. Again, I've been talking about the science of nigromancy so much. I'm excited to put together a multi-part series on that kind of work, the pacting of it, the applied conjurations of it, its approach being folk nigromantic and working with these like groups of chapters of spirits that seem to turn up in a variety of other grimoires in other contexts, like Durus and Arcus we talked about. So yeah, I'll be doing more folk nigromancies, still writing up a bunch of delineations for detailed geomantic divination and magic. Still doing some stuff on Cunningcraft. Obviously, I've been going through a bunch of ghost pamphlets and looking at like some of the practical ways people actually attempted to negotiate with ghosts, as well as just like spooky tales and encounters they had. Just been great going through some of the 17th century pamphlets and things. Continuing to do the do and to see clients and things like that, and just finding time to also, do the things I like, practice more of the book binding, juggle plates.
Are you still playing the mandolin? Are you still doing that?
Yeah, little bits and pieces. Yeah. I dedicated it to some musical spirits, and trying to work my nubby fingers around that. I've been eyeing up octave mandolins as well, for like, Irish bouzouki type stuff. So yeah, still making music, playing with bits and pieces like that. Thinking about not just ritual drone, but like, again, very inspired by Joe Peterson's work on De Secretis and how a lot of the instructions might be translated as sing this incantation, not just not just chant it. And again, working with some spirits of music to try and work out how to do that usefully. And playing with the cats.
So you're still doing consultations. What kind of consultations do you offer people?
I mostly do geomantic readings for folks. A geomantic consult takes about an hour. We set a full shield chart. I have some like specialized options for discounts, things around looking into ancestral work, as well as like matters of the heart, or different kinds of readings on things. I'll be putting up one about specifically like spiritual path kind of check-in type stuff of late. Because that's a kind of reading that I really enjoy doing, being able to help someone like look at their current practice and see where they might want to be concentrating on, or things like that. I do also offer like training and mentorship kind of stuff. You can book me for an hour and chat about an experiment that went really well, or one that went really badly. We can kind of troubleshoot it together. There are also options for that on my Patreon if folks want to be able to like regularly check in with me about ongoing work and stuff like that. And yeah, it's a privilege and a joy a lot of the time to be able to help people do their good work.
Definitely, yeah. There's another thing that, as you've been talking about on your Patreon, of which I am a member, and I implore everybody, if you like Dr. Al's work, if you like the cut of his jib, you have to be a Patreon subscriber. Is that you were putting out this collection. You mentioned it earlier, but I'd like to focus on it a little bit more. The Libraries of the Sorcerers. So a guided tour of Grimoire Magic course series. Folks, if Grimoires are as exciting to you as they are to me, check out some of the ones that Dr. Al goes through. The Heptameron, the Arbitel, the Cambridge Book of Magic, the excellent book on the art of magic, Grimoire Pope Honorius, which I just talked about last episode, everybody, the Veritable Key of Solomon, and the Grimorium Verum. So like that. My goodness. Tell us what do people get if they grab this bundle?
You can get the bundle of the whole series, or you can pick up individual class bundles as well. It's an emphasis on like actually like reading it and working it. There is obviously some history that's my historian training is still going to kick in and give people a context for it, but there's like a pretty close line reading of not just the particular conjurations and orisons and exorcisms and blessings, but also like the kind of the style, or the craft logics of them. Like, what are they emphasizing? What's the underlying approach or mechanics that are at work? How can we, what order we might need to read them in? And some of the ones that's a bit more janky than others. Things we need to bear in mind about like variant manuscripts about some of them. A reading of like tools that are necessary, the kind of operations that are in there, the kinds of spirits that are in there, what we need to bear in mind about them. And again, like a kind of exploration and celebration of the different ways that grimoire magic actually plays out, from very formal to, the bully boy tactics of the excellent book, to the Verum's kind of sense of like, no, this is about like, these spirits won't do anything if we're not both getting something out of this. That like, again, good necromancy is mutual aid, right?
Definitely, yeah. It's exciting. I'm going to definitely be grabbing a few of those. Man, I love everything that you do, and it's always so fantastic, and I can't wait for what comes next. But please let the folks know, where can they find your work, and where do you exist on the worldwide webs that people can find your work, interact with it, and perhaps even get a consultation if they want to. Where are you in the world of the internet?
I'm lurking at the spider's web of my really creatively named website, which is just alexandercummins.com. There's a talks section there where you can go through like the class and course recordings. There's a consulting section where you can look at different kinds of readings I do, and coaching kind of services I offer. And there's also the Patreon of patreon.com/Dr. Alexander Cummins as well. And I'm on the gram as Grimoires on Tape as well, which is a kind of promise to myself to actually get around to recording some grimoire material on tape and making talismanic cassettes at some point.
Very cool. That'd be awesome. I will have the links as to all of the places to find Dr. Al's work, as well as his link tree, his website, his published work. Everything Dr. Al will be available on the show notes to this episode specifically. That can be found at whatmagicisthis.com. Please head there for all of the relevant links to this episode specifically. and to find Dr. Al and everything that he gets up to. Do you think, perhaps, that what I am doing, that is me, Douglas Batchelor, of the What Magic Is This podcast, is in some way deserving of some kind of financial support? Because this is indeed his job. This is what he does. He wakes up in the morning and he works at his podcast for basically the entire day, 7 days a week. No days off, truly, no days off. But you think, like, you know what? I like what he's doing. I like this podcast. I like this show. And I'd like to support them in some way. Well, there's a few ways of doing this. Let's go through it as we do in each and every episode. So the first way of supporting me and helping me out to live my dream, my life as being somebody who can share this amazing information to the good people is Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. It's $7 a month. That's it. It gives you access to everything. So many things. I have hours and hours and hours of great work. Podcast episodes, videos. I just put out a video about how to make the original trick or treat before there was even trick-or-treating. I did a 20-minute video. It is awesome. People loved it. I've actually had a couple of people say that they made some and they love them as well. But other things. I do episodes about specific entities or saints or even demons from the Ars Goetia. I've done episodes on those kind of things. I have videos on creating magic circles. I have interviews with other people. I just did an interview with The Tale Foundry, which is a YouTube channel that's very popular, and I recorded the interview and I asked them, could I put this up on my Patreon? They said yes, so it's 2 hours of stuff. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people will be like, Doug, when's your next episode coming out? And I'm like, are you on the Patreon? And they'll go, no. It's like, well, for the price of a small can of macadamia nuts, you know those nuts you like from Hawaii? Well, for $7, you get access to hundreds of hours of my stuff on my Patreon. It's like a whole new podcast. It's, in truth, it's my favorite stuff. All of my favorite things I do are going to be on that Patreon. And in fact, an upcoming episode on this Patreon for this month of October is I'm going to be sharing my personally scariest moment doing ritual magic. The thing which nearly frightened me to death. It was beyond frightening. I'm going to be sharing that story this upcoming week from when this episode drops. That's going to be on the Patreon. There's just so much there. It's hours and hours and hours. It's like a whole podcast unto itself. I know I just said that, but Patreon is truly the thing that keeps me alive and keeps me going, and I consider it my best work. And you get access to a fantastic Discord server that is as active as any Discord server is these days. So many great people asking great questions. Everybody gets along. It's so kind. It's so amazing. Basically, all I'm trying to say is for $7 a month, you get to join the What Magic Is This Club on Patreon. So many great things. So many great people. It is well worth its price. And $7 American is nothing these days. That's so cheap. And you get so many things. So I would love to see you there. I have close to 400 people. Let's get me to over 400 people for the month of November, which is my birth month. I'm celebrating my birthday next month. So let's get up to 400 people. I would greatly appreciate that. $7. Patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to What Magic Is This and click on any number of the links there. And it'll send you straight to my Patreon. They're all over the place there. I would love to see your support because I want to keep doing this, and that is the best way to help me keep doing this. Do you want to just throw me a little chunk of change, though, without having to do the whole Patreon, and you don't want all the bells and whistles and all the extra stuff? I mean, I get it. Sometimes you just want to help somebody out, and the best way of doing that is through PayPal. Go to whatmagicisthis.com. Tons of PayPal links there. Just click them. You know those two P's over top of each other, that PayPal logo. Just find one of those. They're all over What Magic Is This. Click it, and then it'll send you straight to my PayPal. $5, $10, $20. It all goes basically right into paying for the things that I pay for this podcast. It's not cheap podcasting, but I do love it, and I want to have the best stuff. And to have the best stuff, you have to pay for the best stuff. And so anything put forward through the PayPal goes straight back into making this podcast run. The little What Magic Is This hamster, I've named him Sebastian. He runs under the wheel that keeps the podcast going. So I pay for Sebastian to keep doing the things that he does to make sure this podcast is as good as it is. Another way of supporting me is because this is the Books of Magic series, and this is the last episode of it. The reason I did it was that I was announcing that there is a What Magic Is This virtual bookstore. So basically every book that I mention on this episode, for the most part, about 95% of them are going to be listed at the What Magic Is This bookshop. That is done through bookshop.org. What that is a group of hundreds of independent bookstores across North America. They all linked together. And so when you buy a book from the What Magic Is This bookstore, that book will come from an independent bookseller who gets a little bit of money. And I also get a little bit of money for putting all those links up, because truly it takes a long time. It does take a long time. And then you get the book you want. So for the most part, if there's any book that I've talked about in this show that you're like, I would like to grab the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, head to whatmagicisthis.com or head to my bookshop link. That is bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, and then find there every single little book list there. It goes by episode, so just find the Magician's Workbooks episode, little virtual bookshop there, and you'll find the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet. Click on that, order it. You got it. It helps me. It helps the independent booksellers, and you get the book that you wanted. So that's a really great way of helping me out. It hasn't been the busiest over the last little while since announcing it, but I know that things will pick up. So if you want a book, you got to get it from the What Magic Is This virtual bookshop. So once more, head to whatmagicisthis.com or go to bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis and grab yourself some of these books, because that's why we're here, right? We love these things. I love grimoires. I love books. If you order from my virtual bookshop, everybody wins. Every single person wins. And I just get a couple of bucks if you order it, and the bookshop gets money as well. So that's and it basically just means that the evil Omnicorp doesn't get your money, because they really don't need any more of your money, right? Just saying. But I would love to see you grab a book from my my online bookshop. The last way of supporting me is, of course, grabbing some merchandise. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu there, go to the little merchandise, and it's done through TeePublic. There's shirts, mugs, stickers, tote bags, all kinds of stuff. And there's about 12 logos. Most of them I have done myself. A couple of them have been done by other people. They're really wonderful. I don't see very much money. I see a tiny amount of money from them. But I think there's some really cool designs there. Basically, as I said, fridge magnets even, everything. You want hoodies, really cool. The designs are cool. And again, I don't see very much money, but I would love to see you wearing them. If you do grab a shirt, please send me a picture. Somebody just sent me a picture over Instagram about a week ago. It was awesome. So I shared it on my Instagram as well. And it's always good seeing people wear my stuff. It's very surreal to me, but it's also very, very cool. And I love the fact that people like my merchandise, and I just get to see stuff that I've created on other people's bodies. That's weird. It's weird. It's wonderful. It's wacky. It's just great. But again, don't see a ton of financial love that way, but I do get the representational love, which is just as important. I love that. Although it doesn't put food on the table, but I do love seeing people wear my stuff. It's amazing. But all of these things, the Patreon, the PayPal, the bookshop, as well as the merchandise shop, to grab yourself a t-shirt, all of these things, as well as the show notes for this episode, are available at whatmagicisthis.com. I would love to see you there. Go grab some stuff. Go click around. It's always awesome. My goodness. So first guest 3 times on What Magic Is This? And, I would say third time's the charm, but you've been so charming each and every time. You see what I did there? That was pretty good.
That was good.
I did
that. Was damn fine.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm
pretty charming yourself as well. No, I always appreciate talking to you. Hooray for hat tricks.
That's right. And this has just been so fun. I love absolutely a lot of times, and I'm not saying this to slag off other guests, but it's like it's work. What I do is work, and a lot of times it feels like work. I find anytime I interact with you or going to have you on the show, it's always fun from beginning to end. It's just an enjoyable process because I know I'm going to learn a ton when I have you on the podcast, and I know that the folks are going to get probably, oh, hey, congrats everybody. You just got the best magic podcast of whatever month you listen to this podcast because Dr. Al was on it. So,
well, I appreciate you keeping me on the rails as well. I can go on a lot of long walks on short tangents. So I appreciate the work you put in terms of, working out what we're going to talk about and, getting to nerd out with you about that stuff.
Oh, it's one of my favorite things in the world. So I hope that if I was to ask you to come back on What Magic Is This for the fourth time, that you'd be happy to do so, Dr. Al. But yeah.
Oh, hell yeah.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
That's all I need to hear. All right, everybody, that's the show. I really hope you enjoyed this one. Magician's Notebooks, so much to go on, so much to explore. Truly, like this is a if this is a subcategory of grimoires that you haven't looked into, you're welcome. Get into there. Get some Arthur Gauntlet into your life. Get some Cunning Man. Get the Cambridge book. Get the whatever antiphoner, that thing, and grab it. But definitely look into the work of all the people that we've mentioned because there's a lot here. There's so many directions you can go. Yeah, I'm so happy that we were able to share this with you. All right, everybody, enjoy. Take care of yourself. And until next time, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until then, take care, everybody. Goodbye.